All right, deep divers, buckle up. Because today we're taking a deep dive into something that's got a lot of you scratching your heads. Herpes testing. We've got a mountain of research here. Explainer documents, visual guides, even some personal stories. Whoa! Someone did their homework.
It's smart, though,
Yeah.
because let's face it, this is one of those topics that comes with its fair share of, well, awkwardness
Yeah.
and misinformation.
No kidding. I mean, one of the first things that jumped out at me from all this, the myth that herpes is included in those standard STD tests, the ones you get at a regular checkup.
Yeah, you'd think that would be standard, right?
Yeah.
But the CDC actually doesn't recommend routine herpes testing unless you have symptoms. It's not usually part of those panels that check for things like chlamydia or gonorrhea.
Which just seems wild to me. And get this, another thing I was surprised to learn. You don't actually need to have those classic sores to get tested. There are blood tests for this.
Exactly. And that's where understanding the different types of tests becomes so important, because it can get a little confusing fast. We've got the swab test, which is what they'd use if you do have an outbreak with visible sores. But then we go into the world of blood tests, IgM, IgG, and even something called the Western blot.
Okay, yeah, let's break those down because those seem to be at the heart of this whole deep dive. The swab test, that one seems pretty straightforward, right? Quick swab and you're good to go.
Pretty much. If you have those visible sores, ideally the fresh kind, not the ones that have already crusted over, they swab them, analyze the sample for the virus, and boom, you get pretty accurate results.
Makes sense. But what about those times when you might not have any visible symptoms? Or maybe they've come and gone. That's where the blood tests come in, right?
You got it. And this is where it gets interesting because each blood test is looking for something a little bit different. It helps to think of antibodies like little detectives in your blood. They're created by your immune system to track down specific viruses.
Okay, I like where this is going. Tell me more about these antibody detectives.
So you've got your IgM test.
Yeah.
That's like calling in the first responders.
Yeah.
They show up quickly after you've been exposed to a virus within a week or so.
Seems like the ideal test then, right? If you want answers fast?
You would think so, but
Yeah.
the IgM test is actually considered the least reliable of the bunch.
Really? Why is that? What's the catch?
The catch is those IgM antibodies, those first responders. They don't stick around for very long. If you wait too long after a potential exposure to get tested, they might be gone. And you could end up with what we call a false negative, even if you do have herpes.
Ah, so timing is everything with that IgM test. It's like a race against time to catch those first responders in action. So then what about the IgG test? Is that like calling in the more seasoned detectives, the ones who've got all the case files memorized?
Exactly. Those IgG antibodies are the long-term memory of your immune system. They stick around in your bloodstream for much, much longer, which is why the IgG test is generally more reliable, especially if you're not sure when you might have been exposed.
Gotcha. So say you go for the IgG test, how long do you actually have to wait to get accurate results? Asking for a friend, of course.
I hear you, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And a source of a lot of confusion and frustration. You really need to give your body enough time to build up those IgG antibody detectives. We're talking at least 6 to 14 weeks after any potential exposure.
14 weeks, that's over 3 months. Okay, it's starting to make sense why there's so much emphasis in your research here about not testing too early.
It's crucial, and that's why being open and honest with your doctor about your sexual history is so important. The more they know, the better they could advise you on the best testing timeline for your situation.
It's all about having all the facts to make those informed decisions. Now, we've covered the swab, the IgM, the IgG, but then there's this mysterious Western blot test. What's that all about?
Think of the Western blot as the super sleuth of herpes tests. It's the most accurate and specific test available.
Oh. Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. What makes it so special?
Well, if those other tests are like a basic ID check, the Western blot is like a full facial recognition scan. It's super precise. It's not just looking for any antibodies, it's analyzing the very specific proteins of the herpes virus itself to give you that definitive answer.
Wow, that's impressive. But I'm sensing a but coming. There's got to be a catch with the Western blot, right?
There always is, right? Availability and cost are the two main hurdles with this one. Not all labs offer it, and it's not always covered by insurance, which can make it, well, pretty pricey.
And from what I've read, you still have to wait at least a month after a potential exposure or outbreak to even take it. So much for instant gratification.
Patience is a virtue, my friend, especially when it comes to herpes testing. But hey, accurate information and peace of mind, definitely worth the wait.
You're preaching to the choir here. Speaking of accurate information, let's actually dive into those visual guides you sent. because they really do such a fantastic job of breaking all of this down. This one here, comparing the swab test to the IgG blood test, super helpful.
What's interesting there is that difference in the false negative rates we were talking about.
Right. With the swab test, it's almost foolproof during an outbreak. But that false negative rate for the IgG, especially if you test too early, really drives home the point about that waiting period. It's like looking for evidence before your body has even had a chance to process it.
Precisely. You got to give those antibody detectives time to do their work.
Love that analogy. Okay, so let's say someone is listening to this and thinking, okay, I get it, different tests for different situations, but which one is right for me?
That's where this flowchart you've got here comes in clutch. It walks you through all those decision points, like, are you having symptoms right now? If so, are they fresh sores? If not, when were you potentially exposed? It helps you pinpoint the best test based on your own individual circumstances.
And it doesn't sugarcoat those limitations we talked about, like how long you've potentially had it, any location issues, like not all tests are available everywhere. It's like having a roadmap to navigate this whole testing process.
Exactly. It empowers you to go into that doctor's appointment informed and ready to advocate for yourself.
Which is what we want for you. Knowledge is power, right? Now, this deep dive wouldn't be complete without addressing the where and how of getting tested.
Especially since you've highlighted some excellent resources in your research here.
Right. So beyond just your regular doctor, you've got options Planned Parenthood, OBGYNs, even telehealth services, which I know are super popular these days, like WISP or Good Arcs Care.
Those telehealth options can be a lifesaver if cost or insurance is a barrier, which, let's be real, is a major concern for a lot of people.
For sure. And if you're really set on that Western blot, well, you've done your homework. You've even got links here to Terry Warren and the University of Washington Virology Lab. Impressive.
Talk about thorough. It shows you value-accurate information and taking control of your sexual health.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's say you've navigated the testing landscape. You've waited patiently, or not so patiently, for your results. What happens next?
Well, there are basically three main scenarios. You get a negative result, which, well, pretty self-explanatory. There's what's called an equivocal result, which basically means inconclusive. And then there's the positive result. And while it's completely natural to feel a whole range of emotions if you get a positive result, we want to emphasize that it is not the end of the world. It's simply a piece of information.
Exactly. And you seem to have thought a lot about this possibility because you've included a ton of resources here about what comes after a diagnosis, an outbreak guide, support groups, even tips for disclosure.
Which is fantastic. It shows you're thinking ahead and wanting to be prepared no matter the outcome.
10 steps ahead. You even dug up some pretty interesting statistics. Did you know that 1 in 6 adults has HSV2? That's way more common than a lot of people realize.
It really puts things in perspective, right? And it just goes to show how important it is to have open and honest conversations about sexual health, without all the shame and stigma that often gets attached to it.
You're preaching to the choir again. But it's so true. And honestly, I think you've already started that conversation. Just by seeking out all of this information, by doing this deep dive, that's a huge first step.
It is. And those resources you found, those communities you're tapping into, they are proof that you are not alone in this. There are people who get it, who understand, and who are there to support you every step of the way.
Which reminds me of something I read in one of these support group descriptions. It said, and I'm paraphrasing here, knowledge truly is power. The more you understand about herpes, the less scary it becomes.
It's so true. And the more empowered you become to make informed decisions about your health, your relationships.
Speaking of relationships, you've even included a whole document here on disclosure, having those conversations with partners, which, let's be real, can feel daunting. But again, the fact that you're already thinking about it is a great sign.
And it brings up a really important point. You're not alone in this. These resources you've gathered, these communities, they're here to help you navigate those conversations, to provide support and guidance every step of the way.
It's so easy to feel overwhelmed with all this info, but it sounds like you're well on your way to becoming a herpes testing pro.
Seriously, the amount of research you've done is impressive.
But you know what? It's not just about the tests themselves, right? It's about what comes after. And you've clearly thought about this too because you've included all these amazing resources. We're talking about an outbreak guide, support groups, even tips for having those conversations with partners about your status.
Which, let's be honest, can be one of the most daunting parts of this whole thing.
No kidding. So to have those resources on hand, it's like you're building an arsenal of information and support.
And that's exactly what you need. Because knowledge, as we've been saying, is power.
Speaking of knowledge, something else that really stood out to me from your research, the statistics about how common herpes actually is.
Right. It's one of those things that people don't talk about enough.
Like, did you know that 1 in 6 adults has HSV too?
1 in 6. That just goes to show you how important it is to be informed, to get tested regularly if that's right for you, and to have those open and honest conversations with partners.
And with your doctor, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself in those appointments. Ask for specific tests, explain your concerns. You have a right to be informed and to get the care you need.
You absolutely do. And I think what you're doing here, arming yourself with knowledge, is a huge step in the right direction.
It's all about taking control of your sexual health, right? And not letting the stigma or the fear hold you back from getting the information and support you deserve.
100%. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are amazing resources out there, like the ones you've found. Support groups, online communities, even just talking to a trusted friend or family member. It can make a world of difference to have that support system in place.
It's all about finding your people, right? The ones who get it, who don't judge, and who are there to listen and offer support.
Exactly. And who are ready to celebrate those wins with you too, because there will be wins along the way.
Oh, absolutely. Like, imagine the feeling of finally getting those test results back and having that clarity and peace of mind.
Or finding a community where you feel seen and understood. Those are huge wins.
They really are. And it all starts with taking that first step, right? Like you've done here by diving headfirst into all this research.
You've already accomplished so much just by being here, by being curious, by wanting to learn.
It's inspiring, honestly. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning of your sexual health journey.
I have a feeling you're right.
Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we've talked a lot about the emotional and social aspects of herpes testing and diagnosis. But let's shift gears for a second and get a bit more practical, shall we? Because there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to address. And that's what to do with all this newfound knowledge. How can you actually use it to make informed decisions about your health and your relationships?
Great question. And I think it's different for everyone. But I would say, first and foremost, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself, whether it's with your doctor, your partners, or even just within yourself.
Advocate for your right to accurate information, for testing, for support.
Precisely.
And don't be afraid to have those tough conversations.
The more open and honest you are with yourself and with others, the less power those feelings of shame and stigma will have over you.
It's about reclaiming that power, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's about taking all of this information and using it to make choices that are right for you.
Because at the end of the day, your sexual health is your business.
Preach.
And you get to decide how you want to navigate it.
With knowledge and confidence.
Now, I know we've covered a ton of ground here today, deep divers, but before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought, something to really chew on. We've talked about the tests, the resources, the importance of self-advocacy. But what about the bigger picture? How might this newfound knowledge about herpes testing, about sexual health in general, impact your relationships moving forward?
Now that's a question worth pondering.
It is. Because sometimes the most profound transformations happen not just in our minds, but also in the ways we connect with others.
So true.
So as you continue on this journey of exploration and discovery, remember that you don't have to do it alone.
We're here with you every step of the way.
You know, going through all this research with you, it really struck me how much emphasis is placed on the emotional and social aspects of herpes. It's not just about the medical stuff. It's about the impact on relationships, on self-esteem.
Absolutely. And that's something that often gets overlooked.
Right. It's like everyone focuses on the physical symptoms and the testing.
Yeah.
But then what? What happens after you get a diagnosis? How do you deal with the emotional fallout?
That's huge. And it's different for everyone.
Exactly. And that's why I'm so glad you included all those resources about disclosure, about support groups, about navigating those conversations with partners.
Those resources can be lifelines, honestly.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, those conversations can be tough.
Mm.
But you've clearly thought a lot about this, which is awesome.
Well, and even just having those resources on hand, it's like having a safety net. Like, okay, if I ever need to have those conversations, I know where to turn for help.
Exactly. And you know what? You are not alone in this. Herpes is incredibly common. Way more common than people realize.
Seriously, I feel like those stats we talked about earlier really put things in perspective. 1 in 6 adults having HSV too. That's wild.
Right. It just goes to show you that this is something that affects a lot of people. And it's not something to be ashamed of.
Not at all. And honestly, I think that's the biggest takeaway from all of this research. Knowledge is power, but so is compassion, both for yourself and for others.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as you continue on this journey, remember to be kind to yourself. Arm yourself with information, but also with support. And don't be afraid to reach out for help when you need it.
Because you are not alone, and you've got this.
Deep divers, that's a wrap on another deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, take care of yourselves.